Don't touch my son." The words didn't come out loud at first. They sat in Edward Whitmore's throat like something sharp, something that didn't belong, as he stood frozen in the doorway of the nursery, his hand still gripping the cold brass handle, his breath shallow, his mind trying to catch up with what his eyes were seeing under the soft amber glow of a night lamp that hummed quietly in the corner of the room. Because there, seated in the rocking chair by the window, was Naomi Carter, the new maid, her uniform slightly wrinkled from the long shift, her posture steady but tense, and in her arms, his son, Lucas, curled close against her chest, finally still, finally quiet, the kind of quiet that hadn't existed in this house for days, maybe weeks, and for a second, just 1 second, Edward didn't feel anger, didn't feel outrage, just confusion, raw and disorienting, because Lucas had been crying when he left for his call, crying in that relentless, high-pitched way that echoed through marble halls and glass corridors, the kind of cry that made staff avoid eye contact and doctors offer theories but no solutions, and now, silence, thick and unnatural, broken only by the faint creak of the chair and the soft rhythm of Naomi's breathing. But then the thought hit him, fast and cold, snapping everything back into place, and his fingers tightened around the handle as the words finally forced their way out, low and sharp. "What are you doing?" Naomi didn't jump, didn't spin around in panic like someone caught doing something wrong. She just looked up slowly, her eyes meeting his, calm but alert, as if she had been expecting this moment, as if she knew the line she had crossed would not go unnoticed, and for a brief second, neither of them moved, the air between them heavy with something unspoken, something fragile, and Lucas stirred slightly, his small hand tightening against the fabric of her sleeve, a tiny, instinctive motion that made Edward's chest tighten in a way he couldn't explain, but he pushed it down, forced his expression back into something controlled, something cold, the version of himself that built empires and made decisions without hesitation. "Step away from him," he said, louder now, the authority in his voice filling the room like a command that had never been questioned before, and Naomi's jaw tensed. Just slightly, not defiant, not submissive, just steady. "Sir," she began, her voice low, careful, but he cut her off before she could finish, already stepping forward, already reaching for Lucas, because this was a violation, a breach, something that didn't belong in his house, in his world, and yet the moment his hands moved closer, Lucas let out a small, distressed sound, not a full cry, not the screaming he had grown used to, but something softer, more desperate, and Edward paused. Just for a fraction of a second, enough to notice the way his son's fingers tightened again, the way his breathing hitched, the way his small body leaned instinctively back toward Naomi, as if she were the only stable thing in the room, and that pause, barely a heartbeat, was enough for doubt to slip in, unwelcome and unfamiliar, because this didn't look like harm, didn't look like danger, it looked like something else, something he didn't have a name for yet, and that unsettled him more than anything. He wouldn't stop crying, Naomi said quietly, not defensive, not pleading, just stating a fact, her gaze steady on his. No one came. And the words landed differently than he expected, not sharp, not confrontational, just true, hanging there in the dim light, impossible to ignore, and Edward felt something shift, small and uncomfortable, like a crack forming in something solid, but he didn't let it show, couldn't afford to, not here, not now, because control was the one thing he never lost, the one thing that defined him. And yet as he stood there, watching his son settle again, watching the tension leave Lucas's tiny frame as Naomi's hand moved in slow, gentle motions across his back, Edward realized, with a quiet, unsettling clarity, that for the first time in days, his son wasn't crying, and he had no idea why. "Call Dr. Harris." Now. The command came out sharper than Edward expected, cutting through the stillness of the nursery as he stepped fully into the room, his shoes barely making a sound against the thick carpet. But the tension in his shoulders was unmistakable, coiled tight, like something waiting to snap, because even as he said the words, his eyes had not left Lucas, not for a second, watching every small movement, every breath, every subtle shift in the child's face as Naomi continued that slow, steady motion, her hand moving across the boy's back in a rhythm that felt almost practiced, almost instinctive, and that unsettled him more than anything else, because nothing about this situation was supposed to feel natural, and yet it did, in a way he could not explain, in a way he did not trust. "Sir," Naomi said again, softer this time, not interrupting, not challenging, just placing the word carefully into the space between them, as if testing whether it would be allowed to exist there. But Edward raised a hand slightly, not looking at her, signaling silence without even thinking about it, because control was slipping, and he could feel it, in the way his thoughts did not line up cleanly, in the way his instincts were pulling in two different directions, one telling him to remove his son immediately, to restore order, to correct what looked like a breach, and the other forcing him to stay still, to observe, to wait, something he had never been good at, something he had built an entire life avoiding. The sound of footsteps approached quickly from the hallway, controlled but urgent, and a moment later, the door opened just enough for Margaret, the house manager, to step in, her expression already tense, already calculating, as if she had sensed the shift in the house before even seeing it. "You called for the doctor?" she asked quietly, her eyes flicking once to Naomi, then to Lucas, then back to Edward, taking in the scene in a single, efficient glance, and Edward nodded once, his jaw tight. "Immediately," he said, his voice lower now, steadier, but no less firm, and Margaret hesitated, just a fraction of a second, the kind of hesitation that only someone deeply familiar with a household would allow themselves, before stepping back to make the call, the door closing softly behind her, leaving the three of them in that same suspended moment. And then Lucas shifted again, a small sound escaping him. Not a cry, not yet, but enough to make Edward move forward again, slower. This time, more deliberate, as if approaching something fragile, something that could break with the wrong kind of pressure. "He needs to be checked," Edward said, more to himself than to Naomi, but she heard it, her eyes lowering briefly to Lucas, then lifting again, steady. "He was checked this morning," she said, her voice still calm, still measured. They said everything was fine, and there was no accusation in her tone, no blame, just information, simple and direct, and that, more than anything, made it harder to dismiss, because it left no room for defense, no obvious argument to push back against, only the uncomfortable weight of what might have been missed. Edward's gaze flicked to the side, to the small table near the crib, where a bottle sat half full, the liquid inside slightly cloudy under the dim light, and, for a brief second, his attention caught on it, something about the way it looked, the way it had been left there, and used, and then his eyes moved back to Lucas, to the way the child's breathing had evened out again, the tension in his small body easing as Naomi adjusted her hold just slightly, not dramatic, not noticeable unless someone was watching closely, and Edward realized he was watching closely, more closely than he had watched anything in weeks, maybe months, because this mattered in a way numbers and contracts never did, and that realization sat heavy in his chest, unfamiliar and unwelcome. "You should not have done this without permission," he said finally, the words coming out quieter now, less like an accusation and more like something he needed to say to re-establish the structure he understood, and Naomi nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. "I understand," she said, and there was no apology in it, no attempt to soften the moment, just acceptance of the line he believed had been crossed, and yet she did not move, did not hand Lucas over, did not step back, because the moment she shifted even slightly, Lucas's fingers tightened again, that same small, instinctive grip, and Edward saw it, felt it, that subtle resistance, that quiet dependence, and something in him hesitated again, longer this time, long enough for doubt to grow into something heavier, something harder to ignore. Because if this was wrong, if this was a violation, then why was it the first thing that had worked? The silence did not last, because Lucas's breathing changed again, subtle at first, just a slight hitch in the rhythm that only someone watching closely would notice, and Edward noticed it immediately now, his attention locked in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable, as if his entire world had narrowed down to the rise and fall of his son's chest, the faint sound of air moving through small lungs, the tiny tension that returned to his fingers as they curled again into Naomi's sleeve, and then the sound came, a soft whimper, fragile but unmistakable, and Naomi reacted before anyone else. not with panic, not with urgency, but with a quiet shift, adjusting her hold just enough. Her hand moving to support Lucas's back, while her other hand traced a slow, steady line along his shoulder, a motion so gentle. It barely seemed like movement at all, and yet the effect was immediate, the whimper fading before it could grow into something louder, something sharper, something Edward had come to dread, and he stood there, watching it happen again, watching something he could not control resolve itself without him, and that realization settled deeper this time, heavier, harder to ignore. The door opened again, this time more quickly, and Dr. Harris stepped in with a small medical bag in one hand, his expression alert but composed, the kind of calm that came from years of dealing with situations that shifted without warning. "You said he was in distress," he said, already scanning the room, his gaze moving from Edward to Naomi to Lucas in a practice sequence, and Edward gestured slightly, his voice controlled but tight. "He was crying for hours," he said, "and now this." And the word "this" hung in the air, undefined, complicated, carrying more weight than he intended, because even he did not know what to call it anymore. Dr. Harris stepped closer, careful, observant, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the details, Lucas's relaxed posture, the steady breathing, the way his small hand remained anchored to Naomi's uniform as if it were the only point of stability he trusted. "May I?" the doctor asked, not reaching yet, waiting, and Naomi nodded once, slowly, her movements deliberate, as if she understood exactly how much disruption even a small change could cause. Dr. Harris knelt slightly, his hand hovering for a moment before gently touching Lucas's wrist, checking his pulse, his expression shifting just slightly, not alarmed, not relieved, just thoughtful. "His heart rate is stable," he said quietly, almost to himself, and Edward frowned, stepping closer now. "That is not possible," he said, more sharply than he intended. "He has not been stable all day," and Dr. Harris glanced up at him briefly, then back to Lucas, continuing his assessment with careful precision, listening to his breathing, observing the subtle cues that most people would miss. "Children respond to more than just medical input," he said after a moment, his tone neutral, clinical but not dismissive, and Edward's jaw tightened slightly, because that was not an answer, not one he could measure, not one he could quantify, and yet it was the only one being offered. Dr. Harris stood, slowly, his gaze shifting to Naomi now, studying her with a quiet curiosity. "How long has he been like this?" he asked, and Naomi answered without hesitation. "About 15 minutes, her voice steady, her focus still on Lucas, not seeking approval, not defending herself, just stating what she knew. And Dr. Harris nodded once, processing, then turned slightly toward Edward, lowering his voice just enough to separate the conversation without fully excluding Naomi. "Whatever changed," he said. It worked, and the simplicity of that statement landed harder than any technical explanation could have, because it left no room for argument, no space for control, just a result that could not be ignored. Edward exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest shifting into something else, something quieter but more persistent, and his eyes moved again, almost involuntarily, to the small table by the crib, to the bottle still sitting there, untouched, the cloudy liquid inside catching the dim light, in a way that suddenly felt wrong. And this time, he did not look away as quickly, because something about it did not fit, not with what he was seeing now, not with the way Lucas had reacted all day, and that small detail, insignificant on its own, began to pull at the edges of his understanding, forming the outline of a question he had not yet fully asked, but could no longer ignore, because if nothing was wrong, if everything had been checked, then why had his son only calmed down now, in the arms of someone he barely knew, someone who had crossed a line he could not yet define, and why did it feel less like a mistake, and more like the first thing that had gone right? Edward did not speak right away, because once he saw it, he could not unsee it, the bottle sitting there on the edge of the small oak table, tilted slightly as if it had been set down in a hurry, the measurement markings faint under the low light, the liquid inside no longer smooth but uneven, faintly separated, and something about that detail pressed against his mind with quiet insistence, not loud enough to be a conclusion, but strong enough to be a doubt, and doubts were not something he tolerated easily, especially not in his own home. especially not when it came to his son. That bottle, he said finally, his voice lower now, less commanding but sharper in focus. And Dr. Harris followed his gaze, stepping closer, picking it up carefully, turning it slightly so the light caught it differently, his expression shifting, subtle but noticeable, as his thumb brushed along the side where the expiration date was printed in small, almost invisible text. And then he paused, just for a second, the kind of pause that did not belong in a routine check. When was this prepared? The doctor asked, not looking at Edward yet, his tone still neutral but no longer casual, and Edward's eyes flicked toward the door instinctively, toward the direction where Margaret had disappeared earlier, and something cold settled in his chest. Not anger yet, not fully, just the early shape of it forming. Margaret oversees all feedings, he said, his voice measured, controlled, but the control felt thinner now, stretched over something less stable, and Dr. Harris nodded once, still examining the bottle, then tilted it slightly, letting the liquid move, watching how it responded. This should not look like this, he said quietly, almost more to himself than to anyone else. And that sentence, simple and clinical, landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it carried the weight of fact, not interpretation. Edward stepped closer now, his presence filling the space beside the doctor, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the bottle again, this time not as a routine object, but as a variable, a possible answer to a question he had not fully formed until now. And behind him, Naomi did not move, did not interrupt, but her posture shifted slightly, her grip on Lucas adjusting just enough to keep him steady as the room changed around them. Because something was changing, something quiet but irreversible, the kind of shift that happens when certainty begins to crack. Call her back, Edward said, his voice no longer raised, no longer sharp, but firm in a different way, controlled with intention rather than instinct. And a moment later, footsteps returned, slower this time, more cautious, and Margaret appeared in the doorway again, her posture composed, her expression professional, but her eyes flickered briefly to the bottle in Dr. Harris's hand, and that flicker did not go unnoticed. Is there a problem? She asked, her tone even, practiced, but something underneath it felt tighter now, less certain, and Edward did not answer immediately. He just looked at her, really looked this time, not as part of the system that kept his household running, but as a person standing in a moment that required explanation, and that shift alone changed the air in the room, because Margaret felt it, the difference in his attention, the absence of assumption, replaced by scrutiny. This bottle, Edward said slowly, each word placed with precision. When was it prepared? And Margaret hesitated, just slightly, just enough, her eyes moving quickly, calculating, before settling back into composure. Earlier this afternoon, she said, and Dr. Harris lifted the bottle slightly, turning it again so the printed date was visible. It expired yesterday, he said, and the room did not react loudly. There was no outburst, no raised voices, just a quiet shift, like something invisible had been uncovered, something that changed the meaning of everything that came before it, and Margaret's posture stiffened, not dramatically, not obviously, but enough. It must have been overlooked, she said quickly, her tone still controlled, but now carrying a thin edge of urgency. We go through dozens of these a week. It was likely a mistake, and Edward did not respond right away, because his attention had already moved back to Lucas, to the steady rise and fall of his chest, to the absence of distress, to the quiet that had returned only when Naomi stepped in, and the connection, once vague, now felt clearer, sharper, impossible to ignore, because if the bottle had been wrong, if the feeding had been wrong, then everything that followed made sense in a way that unsettled him deeply. He would not eat, Naomi said softly then, not interrupting, not inserting herself into the accusation, just adding a piece of truth into the space that had opened. He turned away every time, and Edward closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, because the image formed instantly, his son refusing something he could not tolerate, crying without relief, while the system around him continued without question, and then Naomi, stepping outside that system, doing something she was not authorized to do, something that looked like a violation, but in reality, might have been the only correct decision made all day. And when Edward opened his eyes again, the room felt different, not louder, not more chaotic, but clearer, as if the noise had been stripped away, leaving only what mattered. And for the first time since he walked into that nursery, he was not looking at Naomi as someone who crossed a line, but as someone who saw what everyone else had missed. No one spoke for a long second after Naomi's words settled into the room, because there was nothing left to interrupt them, no noise to hide behind, no assumption to lean on, just the quiet truth hanging in the air like something too simple to have been missed and too important to ignore. And Edward felt it fully now, not as a passing doubt, but as a shift that reached deeper than the moment itself, because it was no longer about what Naomi had done, it was about what everyone else had failed to see, including him. And that realization did not arrive loudly. It did not demand attention. It just sat there, steady and undeniable, reshaping everything around it. Dr. Harris placed the bottle gently back on the table, his movements slower now, more deliberate, as if the object had taken on a different weight, and he turned slightly toward Edward, his voice low but clear. If he was refusing this, then his reaction makes sense, he said, not accusatory, not defensive, just connecting the pieces in a way that felt almost clinical, but the implication behind it carried something else, something heavier, because it meant the distress had not been random, it had not been unexplained, it had been a response, and responses always had causes. Edward exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting back to Lucas again, to the calm that remained, to the absence of the sharp, relentless crying that had filled the house earlier. And he realized something else then, something quieter, but just as unsettling. He had not been there when it started, not fully, not in the way that mattered. He had been present, physically, but his attention had been elsewhere, divided, occupied by things that now felt distant, almost irrelevant compared to this small, steady moment unfolding in front of him. And that recognition did not come with guilt exactly, not yet, but it came with awareness, and awareness was harder to ignore. Margaret shifted slightly near the doorway, her composure still intact, but the edges of it were thinner now, less certain. It was an oversight, she said again, softer this time, as if repeating it might solidify it into something acceptable, something that could be moved past. But Edward did not respond immediately, because his focus had shifted entirely, not to her, not to the explanation, but to Naomi. And when his eyes met hers this time, it was different. The judgment that had been there before was gone, replaced by something quieter, something more complicated, not quite trust, not yet, but no longer suspicion either, just recognition. You noticed, he said finally, his voice lower than before, not a question, not an accusation, just a statement. And Naomi nodded once, her expression unchanged, her posture still steady. He kept pushing it away, she said, her voice calm, almost gentle. And he was getting weaker from the crying. And the simplicity of that explanation made it harder to dismiss, because it did not rely on expertise, it did not require authority, it was observation, direct and human, something anyone could have seen, and yet no one had acted on it. Edward's gaze dropped briefly to Lucas's hand again, still holding onto Naomi's sleeve, still anchored in a way that spoke without words, and something shifted again, smaller this time, but just as important, because for the first time, he did not see that connection as a problem. He saw it as a result, the natural outcome of someone being present when it mattered, and that distinction changed everything. Dr. Harris cleared his throat lightly, breaking the silence just enough to move things forward. For now, he is stable, he said, his tone steady. I would recommend we monitor him and switch to a fresh supply immediately. And Edward nodded once, the decision already forming before the words were finished. Dispose of all current stock, he said, his voice firm again, but no longer sharp, no longer driven by reaction, now guided by clarity. And Margaret nodded quickly, stepping back to carry out the instruction, her movements efficient but quieter than before, as if the room itself had shifted its expectations. And when she was gone, the space felt different again, less crowded, less tense, just the three of them and the soft rhythm of Lucas's breathing filling the silence. Edward remained where he was for a moment, then took a small step forward, closer than he had been before, not reaching out, not interrupting, just observing. And for the first time since he entered the room, he did not feel the need to take control of the situation, because it was already under control, just not by him. And that realization did not threaten him the way it once would have. Instead, it settled into something quieter, something closer to understanding. He is not crying, Edward said softly, almost to himself. And Naomi glanced down at Lucas briefly, then back up, her voice just as steady as before. He just needed someone to listen, she said, and Edward did not respond right away, because the words were simple, almost obvious, and yet they carried a weight he had not expected, because listening was not something he had ever considered a solution, not in a world where problems were fixed with decisions, with action, with control, and yet here, in this quiet room, with his son finally at peace, it felt like the only thing that had actually worked, and for the first time that night. Edward Whitmore did not try to change what was happening. He just stood there and let it be. The room did not return to what it was before, because something invisible had already shifted and refused to settle back into place. And Edward could feel it in the way he stood there now, no longer at the threshold, no longer holding himself apart from the moment, but inside it, present in a way that felt unfamiliar, almost disorienting, as if the rules he had relied on no longer applied in quite the same way. And Naomi remained in the chair, her posture relaxed but attentive, her movements small and intentional as she adjusted Lucas slightly, careful not to wake him fully, the soft fabric of her uniform brushing faintly as the rocking chair creaked in a slow, steady rhythm, and the sound filled the quiet space in a way that felt grounding, steady, something Edward had not noticed before, not because it was not there, but because he had never been still enough to hear it, and now that he was, it settled into him in a way he did not expect. "You did not call anyone," Edward said after a moment, his voice quieter now, not accusatory, but searching, as if he was trying to understand the decision rather than challenge it. And Naomi glanced up briefly, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "There was no time," she said simply, her tone even, her words placed carefully, and Edward frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in thought, because time was something he controlled, scheduled, measured, and the idea of acting without it, of deciding in a moment without consultation, without confirmation, was not something he allowed easily. And yet here, in this room, that exact choice had made the difference. "You made that decision on your own," he said, more slowly now, as if testing the weight of the statement. And Naomi nodded once, not defensive, not proud, just acknowledging what had already happened. "Yes, sir," she said, and there was no apology in it, only responsibility, quiet and steady, and that distinction did not go unnoticed. Edward's gaze shifted again, briefly, to Lucas, then back to Naomi, and for a second, something unspoken passed between them, something that did not need explanation, because the evidence was already there, in the calm breathing of the child, in the absence of distress, in the way the entire house had finally gone quiet. After hours of tension, and Edward exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible, but it carried something with it, something heavier than before, not frustration, not control, but something closer to recognition. "Most people would have waited," he said, his voice low, almost reflective, and Naomi's eyes softened just slightly, not in emotion, but in understanding. "Most people did," she replied, and the truth in that sentence landed without force, without emphasis, but it held its place firmly, because it did not need to be argued. It was already proven. Edward did not respond immediately, because there was nothing to counter it with, no justification that would erase what had already happened, and for a moment he simply stood there, allowing the silence to remain, allowing the meaning to settle, and that alone was a change, because silence had always been something he filled, something he controlled, not something he allowed to speak on its own. The faint sound of Lucas's breathing continued, steady and calm, and Edward found himself listening to it again, focusing on it in a way that felt instinctive now, not forced, not analytical, just present. And then, almost without thinking, he took another step closer, reducing the distance between them, not enough to intrude, but enough to feel included in the moment rather than separate from it. And Naomi did not react to the movement, did not shift, or pull away. She simply continued what she was doing, maintaining the same steady rhythm, the same quiet presence that had changed everything. And Edward noticed something else then, something small but undeniable, Lucas's hand had loosened slightly, his grip on Naomi's sleeve no longer tight with need, but relaxed with comfort, and that difference, subtle as it was, carried more meaning than any explanation could have, because it spoke of trust, not desperation, of safety, not distress, and Edward's chest tightened slightly, not with tension this time, but with something else, something quieter, harder to define, because it was not something he had experienced often, not in this context, not in this way. "Stay," he said finally, the word coming out softer than expected, not a command, not an order, but something closer to a request, and Naomi looked at him for a moment, searching his expression briefly, as if confirming what had changed, and then she nodded once. "Yes, sir," she said, and the words felt different now, not just compliance, but agreement, and Edward did not correct her, did not redefine the terms, he simply accepted it, because for the first time that night, he understood that control was not what had fixed this, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed someone else to hold what mattered most without trying to take it back. Edward remained standing near the rocking chair, the soft creak marking each small shift of Lucas's body as Naomi adjusted him. And for the first time, he allowed himself to notice the details around the room. The way the amber light from the lamp hit the corner of the crib, casting long, soft shadows on the walls, the faint scent of lavender from the freshly laundered blankets, the slight chill from the open window letting in the night air, and the quiet rhythm of Naomi's breathing as she maintained a steady, unobtrusive hold on his son. And in that quiet, Edward felt a strange tension ease from his shoulders, not entirely gone, not replaced by relief, but softened, like the first drop of water easing into a dry basin, because he realized that for the first time, no one else in the household had acted, no one else had noticed, and yet the moment that mattered most had been preserved, had been saved, by someone who had quietly stepped into the space without asking for permission, without defying protocol in any dramatic way, just doing what needed to be done, and that understanding settled into him with a slow, deliberate weight, forcing him to reconsider the assumptions he had made, the judgments he had held, the measure of authority he believed necessary to ensure safety, and he shifted slightly, his eyes tracing the gentle line of Lucas's back against Naomi's arm, the small tilt of the child's head, the relaxation that had replaced tension, and he realized he had been measuring the wrong things all along, focusing on structure instead of presence, rules instead of understanding, control instead of care, and it struck him now, with undeniable clarity, that this had worked not because of him, not because of any instruction, not because of authority, but because of simple attention, quiet presence, and a willingness to act when no one else had. And that truth was heavier than he expected, because it required him to let go, to admit that he had been wrong in his assumptions, in his hesitation, in his insistence on procedure over instinct. And he swallowed, the movement almost imperceptible, but enough for Naomi to notice, her eyes flicking up to his briefly, reading the subtle shift in expression, and she did not react with fear or relief, just acknowledgement, steady and calm, like a confirmation that he had understood, and in that understanding, a new possibility arose, one he had not anticipated, that control was not always the solution, that influence did not always need to be asserted, that strength could be demonstrated through observation and trust. And as he considered it, he found his stance loosening, his posture softening imperceptibly, and he stepped a fraction closer, maintaining distance but closing the gap enough to share the space of the moment without intruding, and Lucas shifted slightly, his fingers curling gently around Naomi's sleeve, the movement small, almost imperceptible, yet it communicated everything without words, trust, comfort, security, and Edward realized that he had never fully witnessed such a connection before, that he had never allowed himself to, and it gave him a pause that was entirely new, entirely necessary, because it required him to see beyond rules, beyond expectation, beyond authority, and simply witness the result of care applied with thoughtfulness, presence, and patience. And in that moment, the room felt suspended, the soft light, the steady breathing, the faint creak of the chair, all combining into a rhythm that was gentle, deliberate, and wholly calming. And Edward exhaled, slowly, deliberately, a release of tension that had accumulated over weeks, months, years, not because the problem had been solved in a conventional sense, but because it had been approached correctly, compassionately, quietly, and he finally understood, fully and without hesitation, that Naomi's action, unassuming, patient, deliberate, had done more for Lucas than his control ever could, and he nodded almost imperceptibly, not as an instruction, not as assertion, but as recognition, acknowledgement of a job done right, of a need met correctly, of an instinct honored, and in that quiet nod, the night settled further into stillness. Lucas remained peaceful, Naomi's presence steady, and Edward, standing slightly apart, allowed the stillness to hold him, to remind him that sometimes the right action requires observing, trusting, and letting others carry what they are capable of handling. The quiet of the nursery seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Each small sound magnified in the space between walls, the faint creak of the rocking chair, the soft rustle of blankets, the subtle hum of the night lamp, and Edward Whitmore felt it all, each detail pressing into his awareness with a clarity he had not allowed himself before, because usually the world moved too quickly, decisions came too fast, and authority required action without pause. But now he was forced to stand still, to observe, to let the moment speak before he intervened, and as he did, he noticed the small movements of Lucas, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the way his tiny fingers relaxed along Naomi's sleeve, the slight tilt of his head against her arm, and it was more powerful than any command he could give, more meaningful than any instruction, because it was a display of trust, not obedience, and it made him reconsider every assumption he had brought into the room, every measure of control he thought necessary, every rigid expectation that had governed the house for years. Naomi remained focused, her eyes occasionally flicking to Edward but quickly returning to Lucas, her hands steady, her posture relaxed but alert, a paradox of calm and readiness. And that balance struck him now more than the act itself, because it revealed skill, intuition, and understanding that no rule or protocol could teach. "He is quiet," Edward said finally, his voice low, more statement than question, almost as if speaking it aloud would make it real, and Naomi's gaze lifted to meet his, unflinching, steady. "He needed someone to listen," she said, her tone measured, not defensive, not seeking approval, just stating a truth that could not be argued, and Edward felt it settle over him. The weight of it, not in confrontation, not in fear, not in shame, but in recognition, that he had misjudged the situation from the start, and that misjudgment was not his fault alone, because no one else had seen what she had seen, no one else had acted with the clarity and immediacy that mattered most, and he realized that what mattered most had nothing to do with rank, status, or authority, but with attention, presence, and a willingness to act when no one else would. A lesson he had learned in an instant that would stay with him far longer than any reprimand or procedure ever could, and he exhaled slowly, his body relaxing just slightly, the tension in his shoulders softening as he allowed himself to be part of the moment rather than separate from it, the lines between observer and participant blurring in the gentlest way, and for the first time, he saw Naomi not as an employee overstepping boundaries, but as someone whose instincts were tuned to what mattered, whose care was precise, deliberate, and necessary, and that recognition made him step closer. Just a fraction, closing the distance without imposing, simply sharing the space. And Naomi did not flinch or react. She continued her quiet attentiveness, the way she adjusted Lucas, the way she maintained his comfort, the rhythm of her movements creating a subtle, grounding cadence in the room, and Edward realized that allowing this presence, this careful, capable presence, was more effective than any intervention he could make, any authority he could assert, any control he could wield, because it had achieved what all his instructions and schedules could not, the calm, the safety, the sense of being understood, and he understood now that he had underestimated what it meant to act with awareness rather than power, and in that quiet realization, the room felt different, smaller, more contained, focused entirely on the connection that mattered, the one between Lucas and Naomi, the one he had almost interrupted, almost misjudged, and Edward's chest shifted slightly, a subtle motion, acknowledging the lesson without words, the quiet understanding that he would not unsee this moment, that he would carry it forward in every decision he made from this point. And the gentle breathing of Lucas, the steady hands of Naomi, and the stillness of the room combined into a single, unspoken truth, that sometimes the right choice was not about control but about presence, and that awareness, patience, and trust could achieve what power never could. Edward remained silent for several long seconds, letting the quiet fill the space around him. The steady rhythm of Lucas's breathing, the subtle creak of the rocking chair, the faint hum of the night lamp, all combining into a soft cadence that contrasted sharply with the tense moments that had preceded it. And he allowed himself to observe fully, without judgment, without the need to intervene, taking in Naomi's careful adjustments, the way her hands moved with precision and gentleness, maintaining a secure hold on Lucas while ensuring he remained comfortable, her gaze occasionally flicking to Edward, steady and composed, but not seeking permission or validation. And in that simple acknowledgement, there was a depth of understanding, a silent communication that conveyed more than words could express. Edward's chest loosened slightly as he registered the ease with which Lucas now rested, the absence of the strain and distress that had defined the earlier hours, and he realized that what had brought this calm was not a protocol, not a scheduled feeding, not a predetermined plan, but a quiet presence, thoughtful, attentive, and immediate. And that realization carried with it a subtle weight, the awareness that he had underestimated what it meant to act with intuition and care, and that for all his experience in managing people, schedules, and responsibilities, he had missed the simplest truth, that a child's comfort often required nothing more than someone noticing and responding without hesitation. And as he took another step closer, carefully observing without encroaching, he became aware of the details of the room in a way he had not before, the gentle curve of the window casting a warm glow across the soft blankets, the muted colors of the walls blending with the calm of the room, the faint scent of freshly laundered linens mingling with the air, and all of it contributed to a sense of balance and stability, a contrast to the rigid control he had relied upon. Edward exhaled slowly, letting the tension seep from his shoulders, acknowledging inwardly that the measure of success was no longer in directives or authority, but in the quiet results of attentive action. And as he did, Naomi shifted slightly, rocking Lucas gently to one side, and the movement was imperceptible to anyone not watching closely. Yet it produced the outcome that mattered most, a steady, even breathing, a calm presence, and Edward saw it clearly, the way trust had been earned, not commanded, the way security had been provided, not asserted, and he understood that the lesson in this room extended beyond his son, beyond the immediate concern, extending to the understanding that power without observation, control without presence, authority without empathy, could never replace the effect of someone acting with care when it was most needed. And he felt a subtle shift inside himself, a softening that had nothing to do with weakness, but with clarity. And he realized that recognizing and allowing someone else to carry what they were capable of handling did not diminish him. It elevated the outcome. It changed the result for the better. And in that moment, Edward knew he would not see this simply as a breach, as a violation, as an overstep, but as an example of insight and dedication, a quiet skill applied where it mattered most. And he allowed himself to nod, imperceptibly, a single gesture of recognition, and Naomi's eyes met his once more, steady and calm, as if to confirm the understanding, and Lucas shifted again slightly in her arms, his small hand loosening and curling, relaxed and comfortable, a sign of complete security, and Edward felt the weight of the lesson settle fully into him, the awareness that sometimes the right action was the one taken without instruction, without oversight, with full attention to what was happening in the moment. And he silently acknowledged that this had been that action, and that the room, now filled with a quiet warmth, held more than just a child resting. It held the acknowledgement of care, observation, and trust, and Edward allowed himself to be present in that moment, not commanding, not controlling, not correcting, simply witnessing the effectiveness of thoughtful, immediate, and compassionate action. Edward took another step back from the chair, allowing Naomi to maintain her gentle hold on Lucas without interference. And in that pause, he finally noticed the subtle changes in the child's posture, the way his small shoulders had relaxed, the tiny shift of his head resting comfortably against Naomi's arm, and it struck him how fragile yet deliberate these moments were, how easily they could have been missed if he had continued to rely solely on his authority and timing. And he realized with a growing clarity that control had never been the solution, that observation, attention, and presence had a power all their own, a quiet influence that could stabilize a situation more effectively than any rule, schedule, or command. And he felt a shift within himself, a softening of the rigid expectations that had defined his interactions for so long. Because for the first time he was witnessing care applied precisely where it mattered most, unassuming, patient, and effective, and that recognition brought with it a weight he had not anticipated, a sense of humility that was subtle yet profound, grounding him in the moment, making him aware of the limitations of his previous assumptions. Edward's eyes drifted to Naomi once more, her hands moving smoothly, gently, keeping Lucas secure and comfortable, her attention focused entirely on his needs without hesitation or distraction. And he found himself appreciating not just the act but the thought behind it, the understanding that this required, the awareness of timing, body language, and trust, and it resonated deeply with him, forcing him to reconsider not only his role as a father, but as a presence capable of support without interference. And he noticed the quiet calm settling into the room, how Lucas's breathing had evened out, how the tension that had gripped the house for hours seemed to dissipate in these small, deliberate motions. And Edward felt a growing respect for the way Naomi had read the situation, anticipating what needed to happen and acting without prompting, without assertion, a competence that demanded recognition, not correction. And as he stood there observing, he became aware of the room itself, the muted light casting warm shadows over soft fabrics, the faint scent of freshly laundered blankets blending with the cool night air, the subtle rhythm of the rocking chair aligning with Lucas's breathing, creating a cadence that was grounding, steady, and somehow profound. And he felt the depth of the lesson pressing into him, a quiet understanding that authority could guide but presence could transform. And he exhaled slowly, letting the tension in his shoulders ease, not abandoning control entirely but redefining it, allowing space for someone else's expertise and judgment to guide the outcome where it mattered. Edward's gaze returned to Lucas, to the relaxed curl of his small body, the peaceful expression on his face, and he understood fully now that this peace was not the result of schedules or directives, but of careful observation and instinctive care. And he stepped slightly closer, narrowing the distance not to assert dominance but to witness, to participate without disrupting. And Naomi did not flinch, her eyes meeting his once with a quiet acknowledgement, a recognition of shared understanding without words. And in that acknowledgement, the room held a new meaning, the stillness now filled with trust, comprehension, and subtle connection. And Edward realized that the measure of success in this moment was not control but insight, patience, and the ability to act when it mattered most. And that realization carried with it a weight, a responsibility to allow such care to take precedence over authority. And he remained there, quietly, letting the significance of the moment sink in, appreciating the balance of guidance and independence, the harmony of attention and action, and understanding that sometimes the greatest impact came not from intervention, but from trusting the right person to do exactly what needed to be done at precisely the right time. And in that silence, with the gentle rise and fall of Lucas's chest and the steady rhythm of Naomi's hands, Edward understood the true value of presence and the quiet power of care. Edward stepped back slightly, giving Naomi and Lucas the space to continue without interference, and as he did, he felt a new awareness settle into him, a quiet recognition that the solution to the situation had not required his immediate command, but patience, observation, and the willingness to allow someone else to act where it mattered most. And in that awareness, he began to reflect on the assumptions he had carried into the nursery, assumptions about authority, about procedure, about the necessity of control, all of which now seemed incomplete, because the outcome he witnessed was shaped not by directives, not by instruction, but by the careful, thoughtful presence of someone who understood the subtle needs of a child and acted decisively yet gently. Edward's eyes tracked Lucas's movements, the tiny shifts in position, the way his small body relaxed into Naomi's hold, and the faint tilt of his head, a sign of comfort and trust that had been absent only moments before, and that observation deepened his understanding, emphasizing the importance of empathy over procedure, of timing over protocol, of attentiveness over command, and he noticed the quiet competence of Naomi. The way her hands moved with precision, adjusting Lucas just enough to maintain his comfort, the steadiness of her gaze, the calm, deliberate rhythm that allowed the room to feel stable despite the tension that had preceded it, and Edward felt the weight of realization pressing gently but firmly, that his prior judgments had been clouded by habit and expectation, and that true effectiveness came from a combination of awareness and action in harmony, not from asserting authority alone. And as he continued to observe, he became aware of the small, almost imperceptible details that contributed to the calm. The warmth of the night lamp reflecting off soft fabrics, the subtle scent of clean linens mingling with the cool air from the slightly open window, the muted shadows playing on the walls, each element forming a backdrop that reinforced the safety and comfort he now witnessed, and he felt a sense of humility, subtle yet powerful, that he had not allowed himself to experience before, because he had spent so much of his life relying on control and certainty rather than observation and adaptability. And in that humility, he took a quiet step closer, not to interfere, not to assert, but simply to witness, to share in the moment, allowing the connection between Naomi and Lucas to continue uninterrupted. And he noticed how Lucas's small hand had loosened slightly, his grip now relaxed. A clear signal of comfort and security, a contrast to the tension he had displayed earlier, and Edward recognized that this simple, quiet act of attentive care had accomplished what his authority alone could not, and that realization changed the way he viewed the room, the people within it, and his role in this moment, emphasizing presence over control, trust over direction, and awareness over assumption. And as he stood there, observing the subtle interplay of movement, breathing, and attention, he acknowledged inwardly that success in this context was defined not by compliance, but by responsiveness, not by command, but by understanding. And he felt a shift within himself, a softening of his expectations, a recognition that the calm and security he now witnessed was the product of insight, patience, and deliberate action, and he allowed the significance of that understanding to settle fully, appreciating the quiet expertise Naomi displayed, the stability she provided to Lucas, and the way the room had transformed from tension to calm without a single directive. And in that moment, Edward Whitmore realized that allowing someone else to act with competence and care could achieve outcomes far more meaningful and lasting than any exercise of authority could produce. And he remained in that understanding, silent, present, and attentive, absorbing the lesson fully as Lucas rested peacefully, completely secure in Naomi's hold, and the room felt balanced, quiet, and right in a way that demanded no further words, no intervention, only observation and recognition. Edward remained still, letting the quiet envelop the nursery, the soft hum of the night lamp casting a warm glow over the pale walls and the neatly arranged blankets, the subtle scent of lavender and cotton filling the air, grounding him in a calm he had not expected. And he observed Naomi gently rocking Lucas, her movements precise yet effortless, each shift of her hands and the slight tilt of the chair aligning perfectly with the rhythm of his breathing, creating a harmony that extended beyond the physical into a subtle emotional balance that filled the room. And he felt a profound shift within himself, an awareness that control and authority had not been the solution, that the peace now surrounding his son had been achieved not through instruction or directive, but through attentiveness, patience, and the quiet skill of someone fully present. And in that moment, Edward's mind traced back over the day, the hours of tension and uncertainty, the repeated attempts to soothe his child that had failed until Naomi intervened, and the clarity of her actions now struck him with full force, the way she had assessed the situation, understood the need, and acted decisively yet gently without consulting, without hesitation, and he realized that the lesson carried weight far beyond the immediate moment, teaching him that sometimes the right course of action required observation, understanding, and trust rather than authority. And he felt his shoulders release some of the tension they had held, the rigid posture softening imperceptibly as he took another careful step closer, not to intrude, not to assert dominance, but to witness, to share in the presence of calm, and Naomi's eyes flicked to him briefly, steady and composed, acknowledging without words that he understood the significance, and Edward felt the room itself change in perception, the warm light, the steady rocking, the soft texture of the blankets, and the quiet breathing of Lucas all combining into a cohesive sense of stability and safety, and he recognized the value of patience, of careful observation, and of allowing someone capable to act with the full measure of their insight without interference, and it humbled him, reshaping his understanding of leadership, responsibility, and care, and he exhaled slowly, consciously, feeling a weight lift from his chest, realizing that in this quiet space, the most important measure of success was not in asserting control, but in noticing, understanding, and trusting the right person to act at the right time. And he acknowledged inwardly that Naomi had done exactly that, demonstrating a quiet competence and empathy that had transformed the nursery from a place of tension to a place of peace. And he felt the subtle power of that action settle into him, recognizing that influence was not always measured by authority or command, but by the ability to observe, respond, and provide care effectively. And as he watched, Lucas stirred slightly, his small hand curling gently, the relaxation in his body signaling complete security, and Edward felt the significance, the quiet triumph of presence and attention over rigid structure, and he understood fully that this moment, simple in action but profound in effect, would remain with him, teaching him the value of trust, attentiveness, and allowing the right person to hold what mattered most without interference. And in the soft glow of the lamp, with the gentle rocking of the chair and the steady breathing of his son, Edward Whitmore allowed himself to simply witness, to fully absorb the lesson, and to acknowledge silently the power of careful, compassionate action, present exactly where it was needed, without assertion, without command, only with quiet skill and understanding. Edward remained motionless for a long moment, watching Naomi gently settle Lucas back into the soft blankets, her hands moving with care and precision, the rhythmic rocking of the chair now synchronized with the child's even breathing, and he allowed himself to notice the details fully, the soft amber light highlighting the curve of the crib, the texture of the linens, the faint scent of lavender in the cool night air, the muted shadows dancing lightly on the walls, all contributing to a quiet. The awareness of this shifted something deep within him, a softening of assumptions, a reconsideration of how to measure success and responsibility, emphasizing observation, empathy, and support over authority, and he recognized the quiet courage it took for Naomi to act, to step into a situation where protocol and assumption might have dictated hesitation, and to do so with clarity, calm, and decisiveness. And Edward felt a deep respect grow within him, an understanding that true effectiveness was not measured by position but by insight, attentiveness, and responsiveness. And as he continued to observe, he noticed the subtle harmony of the room, how the light, shadows, scent, and rhythm of movement combined to create an environment that was safe, steady, and reassuring, and he acknowledged silently the profound impact of presence, realizing that allowing someone capable to act without interference could achieve outcomes far beyond what he could alone, and that recognition filled him with a quiet warmth, a sense of humility, and an appreciation for the power of careful, thoughtful action, and he exhaled again, slower, more deliberately, feeling the weight of tension fully lift from his chest as he internalized the lesson, the room now a testament to patience, trust, and quiet competence, and he allowed himself to simply be present, watching Lucas rest peacefully, watching Naomi provide care with skill and intention, understanding fully that in this shared space of stillness and attentiveness, the most important thing had been accomplished, not through command or authority, but through awareness, empathy, and deliberate, compassionate action. And in that silence, Edward Whitmore felt a sense of clarity and resolution, a calm that was both profound and enduring, knowing he would carry this understanding forward, recognizing the quiet power of care and presence, and for the first time, he allowed himself to feel content, not in control, but in witness to something that mattered far more than control itself.